Over to you, Andy.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much. So I want to start by giving you a bit of an intro about me. Okay. So my name's Andy. Hello. Um, and this talk is about a reflection of some of the companies that I've worked for, last few companies. So I want to start by talking about. I used to work at a company called Foot Asylum. Really interesting role, part of kind of a digital transformation that we're trying to do. I was lucky at the time to do a case study with the Teen Topologies authors because we were going through kind of a period where we were building kind of platform teams before the platform team name was a real thing. So that was really interesting. I then moved over to Cinch and spent a couple of years there, and that was really interesting as well because I joined when we were scaling quite rapidly. And I work at Cinch. I was actually presented at the reInvent conference at AWS Las Vegas about 2 years ago. And then I moved over to a company called Prolific last year, which is a really interesting place to work for because it's a real generative culture. Recently been through Y Combinator, and last year raised the second highest UK Series A funding. So lots of interesting things, and I want to kind of wrap some of those things up in some patterns and kind of talk through what those patterns are. I'm also a Teen Topologies advocate, so I'm kind of part of the program. Get to kind of like connect with other advocates. I can see there's one on the call as well. But I also get to spend a bit of time with the authors, and you get to learn about kind of some of the thinking and some of the stuff they're looking at doing and rolling out. But this talk isn't about me; it's about patterns. And the way that I want to frame it is around basically a flywheel for engineering agility. So for people that aren't familiar, flywheel is basically something where you get some things in place and you get motion, and then it becomes self-sufficient and it moves of its own accord. If that makes sense. Um, and it's specifically a flywheel around what I think help drive organizations forward. Okay. And I think these are patterns, and the patterns that help us to get to what good looks like. Okay. So for me, a pattern is something that it could be principles, it could be actions, it could be behaviors, it could be activities, something that you can put a name to and codify it. And then when you talk about it, people understand what you mean by that thing. Okay. I want to talk about patterns that help to make change stick. Okay. Not just change something a little bit and then it reverts back to what it used to be like, but it actually changes things in an organization. And change is pretty hard, okay? Change is hard because we're not dealing with computers, we're dealing with people. People are very difficult, okay? Very complex. So, what needs to be true? What needs to be true for us to be able to change things in an organization? And what's in this flywheel? So, I've got 5 things, okay? 5 things I want to talk about in this flywheel. The first one is that we need an operating system for our organizations. The second one is that we use constraints to our advantage. The third thing is that we anticipate phase changes of scaling. Okay. The fourth one is that we utilize the power of communities. And the fifth one is that we use improvement Carter checkpoints. And when you get these things in place and you start to do them, you start to have communities, you start to have checkpoints. When you start to get all these things in place, you build this motion. And when you start to build that, you get these better engineering outcomes and you get fancy PowerPoint animations. So the first thing I want to talk about is that we need an operating system for our organizations. And when I talk about operating systems, I don't mean this, okay? This is obviously an operating system, but this isn't what I mean. What I actually mean is an operating system based on the book Scaling People by Claire Hughes Johnson. I don't know if anyone on the call has read this book, but it's a really, really good book. And it's a really good book for a couple of reasons. First one is it talks about these operating systems as being a set of actions and norms that are shared with everyone in the company. Okay, it's something, a process that you put in place so everyone understands context and you can scale in a really good way. And this book is written by Claire Hughes Johnson. So she was the chief operating officer of Stripe as they were scaling up from 200 people to 8,000. So she knows a thing or two about scaling organizations and what to put in place. Okay. It's an incredible book. And my call to action is to go and buy this book after the talk. Okay. Go on Amazon. Um, so the reason why an operating system I think is important, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a bit more detail, is because it should be like this. Now, I don't know if people on the call know what this is, but I'll explain. So this is a touchstone, okay? So a touchstone is a real thing. Like you probably heard touchstone has been something that's been mentioned in conversations, but it's basically something that when you get it,
How you doing? Okay.
oh,
You get to the rest?
Yeah, I've been.
If I need to sofa as well, just put the green cushion up and then.
Yeah,
here's someone talking on the call. So basically, a touchstone is a real stone, okay? And what we get in the past is people would actually mark a series of marks against it for gold, okay? So you can see all these different marks against this touchstone, and that's different types of gold. Okay, so back in the day, let's talk 100 years ago, jewelers would have this touchstone and they know what 9 carat looks like, and merchants would bring their gold, they would scratch it and compare. Okay, so you had a baseline and you had something that is an established standard, and that's basically what we need. Nothing more complex than that. We need standards in our organization, and a good operating system makes it clear at every level what we're trying to do. Okay, it's how we communicate progress, it's how we measure achievement, it's our structure. Okay, it's the bones of the organization. And the reason why it's so important is because if we don't have structure, we kind of end up chasing the wrong things, right? Or we don't have the processes in place to help us scale. Phase 1, collect £100. Phase 2, we don't know what phase 2 is, and phase 3, profit. Okay, we need these kind of things in place so we understand why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it. Okay, a few people on the call may be familiar with Simon Sinek's Golden Circle, which is basically, start with why. And an operating system for a company, when applied effectively, should provide the why, the how, and the what. So the why is the mission, the driving force, how we guide decision making. The strategy, it's the actions, it's why we're doing the thing that we're doing. Okay, that everyone gets behind. You have the how, which is the principles, the core set of values. It guides our thinking and helps us to know what the right thing is to do when we're faced with a situation. And then you have what, our objectives, the specific strategies and actions, the actual doing, the things that actually help us to reach our goal. And you start to codify these things, okay? And you put these in a place so everyone can see them. And it sounds obvious, but how many times do you get these kind of questions asked? How do we make a decision here? What does good look like? How do we know if we're actually on the right path? And the fact is, once an organization doesn't fit in a room anymore, you need an operating system, okay? You can only get away without something like this for so long. You need to start writing things down. And some people may scrunch up the face and say, that's not very agile. But we do these kind of things so that we can be agile. We do these kinds of things so we have a touchstone, okay? A touchstone as an operating system. And that's the vision, okay? And it's the mission. It's the strategic intent for the next 3 to 6 months, okay? It's the principles of how we work, okay? And it's what each team's purpose is and how they interact with each other. So, we've got things like our mission and our vision. For example, at Prolific, our mission is to revolutionize how the world learns about people so people can revolutionize the world. Very simple mission, and people can get behind that. We have a strategy, okay, which is, we bring our product bets to an overarching strategy, and we work through that on a team-by-team basis. We have our principles. When you write these things down, you get them in front of people's faces, okay? And it helps us to actually change how our organization works. And the last one I already mentioned is the team's purpose. And you can use things like team APIs from team topologies. It's basically something that you have that says, this is what my team does. This is why it's different from what the other team does. And this is how we work and how we interact and how you can interact with us, what services we provide, what abstractions we have, how you communicate with us, all of that stuff written down. And it seems quite simple and straightforward, but a lot of organizations don't have it. But it's very easy to get up and running. Notion even has an operating system based on the book that you can use as a template. It's as simple as that. Copy and paste almost and put your context in your company into it. You can add things in like the team topologies, team API, and you can get even more advanced and have something like we have at Prolific, which is a full operating system. We have one as a company level, and then we have one that's actually for engineering. And this is the real one, which has what good looks like. It has our constraints that we work within. It has the decisions that we've made. Everything is in a wiki. All of those constraints are something that teams can use to drive better outcomes. And the real reason for needing this, okay, is that organizations have a memory. And what do I mean by memory? Okay, how many people have joined an organization and they get told about what it was like working here 4 years ago? And it was, you joined the company maybe, let's say, last year, and really it's a little bit foggy, the decisions that were made in the past. You've got a vague idea that at some point in the past we moved to GCP, or at some point in the past we decided we were going to pivot into AI, but you don't have all the details. And because you don't have all the details, it's difficult to actually make some decisions sometimes, and you're reliant on a few people that were there to tell you the truth. When the reality is we should actually save our organization's memory to an operating system. So just to reiterate what we mean by that, we've got our mission, our objectives, and our principles. We've got our strategic planning, our team APIs, our goals, and our metrics. But things like racism and actual management mechanisms, how often do people know when they can actually make a decision? If, let's say, for example, your VP of engineering is on holiday for a month, are you able to make a decision around a hire? Are you able to make a decision around signing off a budget on something, or do you have to wait? Things like your communication and documentation practices. How important it is to actually say, this is how we work, and this is how you should communicate with us, and this is how we write up one pages or ADRs, or this is how we do async. All these things should be written down, but actually your operating cadence as well of how often we meet as a company, how often we do all hands, even how often we have a stand up. All these things should be codified to some degree. And you can actually scale this and scale it to different levels. You can have it at a leadership level. I'm looking at the company I work at that we have even a leadership operating system. So people that are looking at what the next step is for them, they can actually see what leadership care about and how they operate and how they one day maybe will want to, apply for a role at that level. So that's point one, that we need an operating system for our organizations. Okay, it's creating some of the structures around our org. The second thing I want to talk about is how we use constraints to our advantage. Okay, constraints are a bit of a dirty word. It's a bit of a dirty word sometimes. We see there's a negative thing. There's a constraint. There's a problem. There's something in the way. But actually, if we start to put in place our own constraints, it can actually move us a lot quicker. So how do we actually find constraints? Okay, how do you know if you've actually found one? Well, let's say you're struggling to find constraints in your organization. The best thing you can do is actually focus on your value stream. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by value stream. So once you start to think of it this way, it becomes very easy to figure out bottlenecks. So when I talk about value streams, I'm talking about two different types of value stream, okay? You've got an operational value stream. So this is the series of actions that we need to be taken in order to deliver value to a customer. If we are an e-commerce website, we will have an operational value stream that probably starts with a warehouse and having some stock. And somebody orders that stock and it has to go from the warehouse onto a truck to someone's front door. Okay, there's a series of actions that need to happen in order for the person to get the thing that they need and for us to get the money that we need as an organization. Okay, operational value streams. You could walk into a factory and see an operational value stream in action for the most part. Then there's this other kind of value stream, which is a series of activities to transform a need into a product or services. And this is probably the one that we see the most of because it's the one that's closest to our hearts. Okay, when we work in product teams, we normally have a development value stream that we work within. And the development value stream enables the operational value stream. Okay, let me use an example from the Team Topologies Academy course because it's a really good example by Nick Hume. Talks about operational value streams for a scooter company, e-scooters. The operational value stream, somebody scans a QR code, unlocks the scooter, rides to the destination, locks the scooter at the end of their journey, and we charge the customer's account. Happy days, we've got money in the bank, and we've got an operational value stream. And then we have the development value stream for one of those teams. Let's say this is the team that works on this scooter API. They discover new API enhancements, they plan their work for the development, they ship it, they support it. This is something that you're probably used to if you work in a team. You see this thing, this is almost your Kanban board for the most part. And the reason why it's super important for us to think about these two value streams is because there's one place that we don't want to get to, and it's this place. And I don't know if anyone on this call knows what this place is. I'll give it a moment. I can see somebody maybe nodding their head. This is your opportunity to speak up. Does anyone know what this is? Can't see anyone. People
Is it the waiting game?
It is. It is the waiting place. Brilliant. Thank you. You're the first person on the talk who actually has known it. Excellent choice in books. Yes, it's the waiting place. Okay. And it's a place where people wait. Okay. People are waiting for things to happen. Waiting for a train or a bus to come or a plane or the mail to come or the rain or the snow. People are waiting. Okay. That's where you have to wait and you're stuck there. And it's where we can get stuck if we don't focus on our constraints and we don't do something about it. Maybe our build time takes, it takes half an hour for us to deploy something into production. We should really focus on that. And we should start to look for opportunities to kind of find gaps, understand maybe the constraint is before we actually ship something, or maybe it's after we ship something. How often do we actually go back and look at the impact of the things that we're building and what it looks like in front of a customer? Do we have end-to-end tests? Are they really slow? There's lots of things we can start to unpick. So that's your homework for next week. is to review the value streams in your company. Okay, but not all constraints are bad. Some can be really helpful. If you know the constraints that you've got, you can impose them. You can actually do some really amazing things. There's a book called Thing Explainer. I don't know if anyone on this call has read this book, but it's a great book. Okay, and what it does, this book, is it explains complex things using only the top 1,000 most common words in the English language. Okay, his constraint is that he can only use the top 1,000 words, which sounds quite easy. Like you could probably talk about maybe going down to the shop and buying something using the top 1,000 words. But if you're trying to explain the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket, try doing that with only the top 1,000 most commonly used words. It becomes very difficult. That's a constraint. But it's really interesting because he's written a book where he's had to explain about the US space team's 5 goer upper, because none of Saturn isn't in the top 1,000 words, rocket isn't in the top 1,000 words. He has to explain things, and it becomes quite a funny book. And you get things like shape checker. Now, shape checker is a padlock. Okay, padlock isn't in the top 1,000 words. But if this was a book that just talked about how padlocks worked, it wouldn't sell many copies. Okay, but this is a really, a good book, a book that a lot of people have read. It's a fun book, and it's all about the constraints that they use. So, what about the constraint for us? Let's apply the top 1,000 words to the Sooner Safer Happier meetup. So I think if you're trying to do that with the top 1,000 words, you'd roughly end up with a group of people meeting up to talk about why other people don't talk to each other enough. Okay, you end up with something like that. So let's talk about some practical examples of useful constraints and how we can actually apply them. So guide rails are really useful constraints. It helps us to understand what good looks like, and they make the other options seem silly. Usually principles like GDS's design principles, they guide you and they make the other option literally seem silly. Why would you not want to understand context? Why would you not design with data? Why would you not do less? Why would you not start with user needs? It makes it very clear what the path should look like and what you should nudge yourself towards. And you can take that to the next level and have guardrails. So guardrails help us to define the wrong way of going around a task or a process and what to avoid. On Google Maps, you can avoid motorways and ferries. But you can actually do some real practical guardrails. So, for example, at Prolific, we've recently moved from GCP to AWS. We wanted to put into place some good constraints, some guardrails around the new work, such as only using Lambda, using DynamoDB, having a pay-as-you-go cost model, some things around how we wanted to do event-driven architecture and trunk-based development and observability, some guardrails to help people to get going as quick as possible. And these guardrails are our table stakes. These constraints help us to move faster. They don't slow us down, because to hit our guardrails are things like teams should have monitoring, alerting, and runbooks. Teams should build dashboards about business transactions. No one really needs to know that much about error codes. What people want to know is the thing that should be happening actually happening in front of people. And if they can't do the thing that they're paying us to, how soon do we know about that? And do we know about it before they tell us? Things around how we communicate with other teams and how we want to decouple ourselves. These guardrails help us to achieve these things. And our table stakes around things like CI/CD, that should be something we do from day one when we start some new work. And constraints can lead us to do some really interesting things, like build a walking skeleton. We can take our guardrails and our guide rails and build a very simple walking skeleton of our services. We say what our constraints are around how we're going to build something. We get it into production as the leanest thing possible to prove that all these guard and guide rails are the right thing to do. And then we build on top of that iteratively, okay? A walking skeleton doesn't add any real value to the end user, it's the customer, but it proves all these decisions we're making are the right thing to do. At Cinch, the walking skeleton became the actual service. It went from a very, very straightforward series of services around some of the core domains into being something that was built out over time. But at first, there wasn't a lot of meat on those bones, okay? And it's super important to start with the minimal viable thing you're trying to do and use your constraints to help guide some of your decision making. And you can do a lot more than just have guardrails. You can build full-on technical blueprints, observability principles, and things like how we do contract tests. These are things that can help people to get up and running very quickly. Again, more constraints, but this is what good looks like. And this stops people having to go through all the different options when the reality is we've already kind of decided what observability looks like. And we kind of already have a real clear idea of what we mean by tracing. So you can follow those things to really get up and running. And you can go even further with your constraints, and you can build golden paths, which is like a shared understanding of what good looks like. We can add all these different things, turn them into a path, and it's the path of least resistance. We've solved a lot of problems, and we've codified them, and you have things like architecture decision records. You don't have to do these things, but it's the easiest way to do the right thing. Okay, pairing by default, observability on day one, using serverless and trunk-based and TDD and event-driven architecture. We codify these things, and they become the way that teams should do things to have the best experience. We don't mandate it. There are obviously other things that people may want to do, but they need a good reason for it. And then who knows, one day it may become part of our page path. And it's important to focus on patterns, okay? And that's what all of this is about. It's not about dictating, here's how you should build everything exactly. You create patterns for people so they know how to do things. If you're learning to drive, you learn how to approach a roundabout. You learn how to merge onto a motorway or a highway. When I reach this technical problem, what's this pattern that I can pull off the shelf to move quickly, okay? You don't need the exact context, you just need to reach the goal. So for me, there's lots of really interesting things there, but the thing that I really like more than anything else is principles, okay? Principles are guidelines. There's a book, Stephen Covey's written a really good book about this, but principles are guidelines for human conduct. They have enduring, permanent value. They're fundamental. So defining principles becomes fundamental to how we want to work, especially if we're trying to transform ourselves and become a better company. So you're going to define your principles. And I think if you're going to have an organization that's transforming and scaling, there's actually two different types of principle. There's doctrine, which are universally useful principles, okay? It doesn't matter where you work or what industry, there's some things that just help you, okay? Things that will give you what you need to be able to move forward. Things like working in the open. Working in the open is a really good principle, but it's not related to one particular industry. Anyone can work in the open. It works, okay? So you've got those doctrine, and then you've got strategic imperatives. So these are principles that are actually going to help move us deliberately forward in a key way. Maybe we want to double down on observability, for example. Maybe we want to make sure that we have user needs at the very heart of everything that we do, because we know previously we didn't. There's some real clear things we can do to nudge our culture along. So a few examples of what I mean by doctrine. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Wardley's doctrine, which is from Simon Wardley. He talks about 4 phases that you can use these universal doctrine in any organization to help you to get better at what you're doing and help you to get situational awareness. Yes, phase 1, which is stop self-destructive behavior. Let's assume that you've joined a new business and you're in day 1. There's some things you can do straight away. You can challenge assumptions. You can understand what's being considered. You'd use a common language. You'd know your users. You'd focus on user needs. These are all key things that make a lot of sense, but it doesn't matter what industry you're in. This is about getting context and stopping the pain points. If anyone's read the Phoenix Project, one of the first things he does is stop Brent being the person that solves everything, okay? And you limit the working process. There's some clear things you can do, some clear doctrines, some clear principles. You can become more context aware. You can start to understand more about your surroundings. You can then do better for less. You start to be leaner. You start to improve processes that are already there. And you continuously evolve. So there's 4 phases, and these are doctrine. These are really useful principles, and it doesn't matter where you work. These can really help you at different phases. So a few of those: use appropriate methods, be transparent, remove bias and duplication, focus on user needs, manage inertia and previous existing practices, and be pragmatic. Some really useful doctrine. And we can go a step further. We can start to put together our own principles, things that are unique to us and that are really going to help us. At Prolific, an example of some of our principles, we're a research company essentially, and we want to put the quality of our research first. So everything that we do should be about the quality and the trustworthiness of our data. And although that's about how we work on a day-to-day, it becomes something you can apply to everything that we do as an organization. We celebrate our differences. We're deeply curious about solving problems, constraints and principles, and things that help move us forward. So what we need to do is augment our doctrine with intentional practices. We'll take things that will work anywhere and things that are unique to helping us grow, and then focus on our constraints. So we have our guardrails. Our guardrails technical blueprints, walking skeletons, and golden paths. Okay, constraints that help us. The third thing I want to talk about is that we anticipate phase changes of scaling. So phase changes is a point where things change. It might be where a liquid turns into a gas, but in our terms, it's about when an organization starts to scale and what that actually looks like. Okay, how do you know if you're starting to scale beyond your current capabilities or structures? Scaling tends to happen in phases. So this is taken from the Scaling People book. It talks about phase one. You're moving fast, but taking on debt. You've got a small team of developers working possibly in a shared code base. You're taking on technical debt. You're not really thinking about what it's going to be like hosting this and moving this in 5 years' time. You need to move fast for market fit. You go through stage two, which is to actually hire more managers. We start to decouple and improve our tooling. We start to think about things like developer productivity. We hire more experienced engineers. We possibly start to undergo some sort of platform decoupling. We migrate things, okay? And we probably split into different business units or tribes. But there's things that don't really scale well. The things that we're learning don't scale well unless you're intentional. Our capabilities don't scale well unless you're intentional about it. Brent doesn't scale well. The single point of failure in any system, okay, is somebody who knows everything and is not very good at sharing it, and things like communication. So what do we need to actually figure out and kind of care a lot about at different stages? When we're small, we have a bias for action. You know, we prototype, we experiment, we're very lean and XP. We break the rules, we don't follow them. We start to grow, and as we grow as a company, we start to be a bit more data driven. We make observability something that's key in how we work. We have product thinking probably across roles a little bit more. We start to think about facilitation as being a core capability. We've now grown, we've got 50 people. How do we do workshops? Facilitation is a core skill that a lot of people don't have. But when you have it, it makes moving fast really good. It makes you able to make decisions and have workshops and become leaner. And when you grow even more and you start to think about things like delivery management and continuous improvement, you standardize things, you think about your value stream management, how to optimize. So there's a few things we need to care about when it comes to capabilities when we're growing. And you'll see we'll get to a point where actually we need to start caring more about metrics and maybe start caring more about portfolios of delivery and things like that. These things happen. So how do we actually anticipate the future scale before we get there? Talked about moving between different stages of growth, but what does that actually look like? And what should we do first? Well, the first thing you should do is what J.R.R. Tolkien did, which is draw a map. Start with a map. Okay. So this talk isn't about world mapping, but I'm going to try and teach world mapping in about 45 seconds if I can. So world mapping is super important in order to understand how you're going to scale. So start the clock, let's say 45 seconds. So in this example about a high street footwear company, a customer needs to buy comfy shoes, okay? There's a very clear customer and a very clear need. In order for that need to be met around comfy shoes, it depends on them having an online store or a high street store. And in order to have an online store, you need an e-commerce platform, okay? Very simple. We've got a need and we've got some dependencies. And that's a value chain. Very straightforward, okay? Hopefully everyone's still with me. So all we need to do now is take our value chain, which is very simple with very clear needs and very clear dependencies, and say for each thing, do we build it or do we buy it? Is it an experimental thing, or is it something that is just a table stakes that every company has? And does it give us a competitive advantage, or is everybody doing it? And there you go, 45 seconds later, you've got a Wardley map. And that's all the Wardley map really is about having a need and having dependencies. And then saying for each thing that's a dependency, where is it right now and where do we want it to be? Okay. And we can start to make some bets. Maybe our platform is hosted on-prem under someone's desk, you know, and maybe in the future is want to move to serverless and the cloud, and it's going to unlock so many opportunities. We can start to reason about our capabilities as we grow. And for each item in that value chain, we can anticipate where it should grow and what would happen if it doesn't. Maybe the competition are already way ahead of us. Or maybe we have been previously focusing on an auth server when everybody has an auth server by default. Logging in is not a competitive advantage, so we shouldn't spend any time on it. We should buy it, okay? And we can change the axis on this and say, well, actually, maybe things on the left of this map are a competitive advantage and the things on the right are the cost of doing business. We can say the things on the left are probably driven by gut. We don't know if it's the right thing to do yet, versus the thing on the right, which is driven by metrics. We can say the things on the left are going to be high future worth. Maybe we have some experimental VR headset. Maybe the things on the right are reducing margin. Maybe we have a warehouse somewhere that we need to look at the systems in. So there's lots of interesting things we can do to understand how we scale. So we've seen what scaling looks like. We know what the future looks like, and now our brain probably hurts. And our brain probably hurts because of this cognitive load. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes to explain what cognitive load is for people that aren't aware, and hopefully it helps you to understand what you should aim for and what you should try and reduce. So cognitive load is basically how much you can fit in your head at any one time when you're doing tasks, okay? If you've ever worked somebody somewhere where you're trying to do one thing and people are asking you to do something else and you've got to figure out how to log into Jira and raise a ticket and do this and do that, you get overloaded and it's difficult to concentrate on what you're actually supposed to do. And that's because our brains are only so big, okay? And cognitive load is basically three different things. You've got extraneous cognitive load, which is difficult processes. It's the things that it's dealing with kind of confusing and convoluted project management tools. Let's say you're an engineering manager, you have to spend all your time trying to work out how to connect a user story to an epic. You're trying to focus on your team and strategy, but actually you're focusing on Jira hell. That's extraneous. It's the stuff that you don't want to have to do and you don't like doing, and it stops you doing the things that you should be doing. You have intrinsic cognitive load, which is learning the things that will help you. It's unavoidable stuff, but it will help provide some value. Things like learning new tech stack, understanding complex problems, technical decision making, okay? And then you have germane cognitive load, which is meaningful learning. Okay, this is the problem solving element. This is the thing that really helps you. This is when you get into a workshop and you're learning as a team. Your germane cognitive load is the thing that's actually being moved here. It's deliberate practice, it's problem solving, it's novel learning. It's a thing that's really going to add lots of value. So what you need to do is figure out ways of having more space for your germane, for your learning, your workshops, your generative practice. Try and reduce, if possible, some of the intrinsic, but you can't really do anything about that to some degree. You're always going to have these things which is going to be the day-to-day work, but reduce the extraneous stuff. Reduce the things that you shouldn't have to care about at all. And in order to do that, you need to work with abstractions, okay? So we need a platform team to provide a starter kit for AWS because not every team should care about security or care about access management. We want to focus on user needs, not user access. We don't want to have every team calculate stock. We've got a finance domain to model over here. We don't have time to go through stock. Some things should be done for us and we just have a nice abstraction. But there's also work that falls between teams. Like who's going to make sure we align our approach to using Datadog? Because we probably could all do this very differently. How do we actually start using AWS in this team? How do we even agree on event-driven architecture? There's lots of decisions, lots of things that fall between teams, okay? And we can use these different types of teams to balance cognitive load. If you've read team topologies, platform teams help with abstractions. They help you to be able to create X as a service interactions and shield teams away from some of the lower level abstractions from, say, AWS. Enabling teams help build a capability across a team and help enable them to do what they need to do. And then there's working groups, which is something that isn't in team topologies and is kind of like an enabling team, but not quite. But I'll explain what these are, because these all help with balancing cognitive load. A really good example of an enabling team is the architecture modernization enabling team, which is Eduardo Silva's got an article on this on the Team Topologies website. And it's an enabling team that helps somebody move from GCP to AWS to kickstart a modernization and keep the momentum going and help a team to build its first service in AWS. It's a really good article. It's a really good example of reducing the cognitive load on some teams by helping them with their capability at the right point in time. Working groups are a really good way to have a short-term team that can work through a problem. Usually it'll be maybe, let's say 10 days, and we're going to decommission the old website that we should have done years ago. It might be that we put a team together to understand observability, get the experts in observability and the people that are real subject matter experts and get them to help codify what we mean by that. We probably want to have a team of people for a week or so that can go through what CI/CD looks like for our front end and make it a better process. So when we talk about cognitive load, we've got opportunities to make things better by having things like enabling teams. by having things like working groups, by having platform teams. Okay. And the reason for that is team topologies is about team fast flow. It's about team interactions. It's not about just the naming. It doesn't really matter if it's a platform team, but what is that team doing? Is it applying the right process and the right things in place to create abstractions so teams don't have to worry about the underlying things and they can worry about what adds value for the development value stream? Okay. So a few things to help around scaling. Scaling introduces capability gaps. We can use things like Wardley mapping to understand our situational awareness. We can balance our cognitive load, and we do that by using different team types to fill capability gaps. So number 4 is that we utilize the power of communities. Okay. Communities of practice connect dots across the organization. At Cinch, this was one of the most impactful things we did. At first, it kind of went under the radar, but became a core thing that made engineers better, generally made it a really good place to work. And what a community of practice really is a group of people who come together around a common thing, a common interest, or a role that these people do. This is an example of community of practice at Prolific. You'll see at the top, we have that EM community of practice. Our engineering managers, they will come together and have time where they can get better at being an engineering manager. It's not about the work, it's about them growing as a EM. Like maybe it's about how to give feedback or do one-to-ones, or maybe it's about progression frameworks, but they have time to meet. And we have these cross-cutting ones like DDD. It doesn't matter if you're an engineering manager, a front end, or a back end person. You might want to be part of a DDD community of practice and learn more about DDD. Okay, and these are really interesting things that you can put in place that help people to grow. Because as you scale, you're normally not wearing 3 or 4 hats. You normally become the person that is good at one role. Okay, you will have a product manager in the early days who maybe does a bit of delivery management, a bit of engineering management, and it's all over the place doing all these different types of work. As you start to scale, that person usually doubles down on what their core thing is as you hire more people. So you need people who can actually help them to get better and have time in the week where PMs can get together and learn about different techniques. And it also helps when you join a new company to have a community around you that tells you what good looks like and helps you to get up and running in the shortest amount of time. Because communities are really custodians of communal memory and knowledge. Okay, there's a really good book called Cultivating Communities of Practice by Etienne Wenger. And they mention in the book, a big part of being a community is the responsibility of being a knowledge custodian. And it's how we commit things to learning and commit what we're learning to our organization. Communities can help organizations get better at things like the definition of the role, like I already mentioned, about learning and development, making it integral, and developing the core capabilities of a business function. But don't take my word for it. DORA, so the DevOps Research and Assessment Group, they find community practice are a key part of elite teams. It's not about big band approaches and centers of excellence and training centers. These are all useful at some point in time, but having a grassroots community of practice is what elite teams use to get better at what they do. And we're very lucky at Cinch to have a lot of our teams be elite performers in the kind of the DevOps, in the DORA measurement, I guess you call it, because of the ways that they worked and what they were focusing on. We had community practices around lots of different things at Cinch, both roles and also interest. And when we got these people together, some really interesting things happened. There's a lot of magic because communities had space and time and purpose and could build a shared idea of what the future should look like and understand how we can get better at things like how we use TypeScript or how we do our kind of like CI/CD pipelines and things like that. There's a really good book by Emily Weber on this. So Building Successful Community Practice is a really good book that condenses down a lot of knowledge into a very easy to run, makes it, you can basically get this book and very quickly get up and running with a community practice in your organization. It's a 101. So get that book as well. There's 2 books for you now. So the final thing I want to talk about quickly is that we use improvement Carter checkpoints. Okay. And what I mean by that is we have regular checkpoints that help us to get better. And the reason for that is that when you try to change things in an organization, it's actually quite difficult. You can maybe have a really good workshop, but then actually off the back of that workshop, people go, oh, I don't know how to do this thing. Or maybe you're trying to move an organization to AWS serverless. You're introducing capability gaps in people. And, even with the best of intentions, people are not going to go, oh, great. You're telling me I don't know this thing. I'm going to go away and learn it. People are going to go, oh no, you're telling me I don't know how to do this thing that I've been doing for years. And that the last 5 years I've been doing here is not what's going to be useful in the next 5 years. So change doesn't really stick and people don't like it. And the impact of what you're trying to do is always hit by negative or distractors. It's scary. It can lead resistance to change. So we need to actually use inflection points and nudges and have a bit of an intentional plan so that we can drive positive change. And there's lots of things you can do at different stages. So having these regular checkpoints around things like DevOps practices, around observability, around incident management, around team API reviews and cognitive load assessments, there's lots of things we can do that we can run on regular cadence, maybe every 3 or 4 months, help us to understand where we are, where we want to get to, and what we need to change as an organization. So there's 4 steps to making change stick here. We start with an agreed measure of what good looks like. It could be an external industry standard, or maybe an internal standard, or maybe a target state of our service. We look at where the team currently is in relation to that standard. What capabilities in the standard do we want to adopt? What current, looking at our current state now, what is the change we want to make to enable the capability, okay? And then we pick the top 4 to 6 things that we're going to improve, and we go and do it in the next 3 months. So let me unpack that with a really good example. So this is something called a DevOps checkpoint, okay, that we used to run at Cinch. And you'd start with an agreed measure of what good looks like as a team. So for example, you'd run the DORA DevOps quick check. You'd answer the questions around, how often do you deploy, how many incidents do you have, all these kind of things. And you start to understand your performance is elite. Now, that doesn't really mean much. By saying the team's elite, great, pat yourselves on the back. The real benefit here is that you understand, well, what can I do to get slightly better? It's the start of a conversation. DORA metrics are not about measuring, they're about starting conversations and improvement. So we look at where we've got that initial measure. We look at where the team currently is. Say, for example, the things that are going to help us to get even better are improving our organizational culture using the Western model. Maybe we need to get even better at observability, and maybe we need to start working in small batches. We can look at our current state, and then what are the gaps? Like if we're going to get better at deployments, for example, what are the things we need to change? We pick those things and we create the improvements. We make that regular ceremonies. We record the result, we compare. And we're not comparing between teams, we're comparing, are we getting better over time at these things, okay? It becomes a cycle of improvement. It's a very clear example. This is from 2022. And somebody on this call who actually was part of this workshop as well. And we checked this team was elite based on the DORA metrics, okay? The things that the actual assessment told us we need to focus on were getting better at our working in small batches and actually getting better at understanding our failures. So we looked at where we currently are, what are the things we wanted to change to get better. We're actually breaking things and doing chaos days, fixing our flaky tests. And these were things that we would take into our next block of work. So to wrap it up, how do we get better at this? How do we actually improve and know if we're getting better? We can use things like fitness functions. So a fitness function is a quantitative measure that gives us a dial, think warmer or colder. We're moving towards or away from a goal. A car has a fitness function, which is miles per gallon. If you drive really fast and you're heavy with your foot, you're going to get a lower miles per gallon. If you're quite gentle and you drive quite slowly, like I do, you probably get quite high miles per gallon. And if you're designing a car and you make it aerodynamic, you're probably going to get higher miles per gallon. So there's a fitness function there. But there's a real example of fitness functions in organizations. You can say, well, what percentage of our users are going through our new Shiny API that we've been working on versus the old one? The more people going through the new Shiny API, the more successful our migration is. We can look at our lead time. Is our lead time getting better over time? Are we reducing the time it takes to get to production, or is it taking longer? And how many times do we maybe manually have to go into a production environment in GCP to fix something versus automation? So there's lots of things we can do to help get better. And that's how improvement character workshops can really help us, okay? So we started with our operating system. We use constraints. We anticipate what change in scale looks like. We utilize communities, and then we create improvement charters. And we get this thing running. And once we've got this running and running, we start to see these better engineering outcomes, okay? And the reason for this working is we want to get away from this place. And hopefully, if you start to put these things into day-to-day process, you will. So thank you very much.